Welcome to the Vandy Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee, finally back from Omaha and settled into Nashville. Today's show will be a conversation with Chip Fridrich. It'll be a long one as we talk about things related to the season. We thank our co-sponsor, Wellspire, Nashville's Learning and Development Center. Wellspire offers personal and professional development opportunities in a beautiful facility in the Gulch neighborhood. Stop by for an event with world-renowned speakers or host an off-site event that will wow your team or your clients. We also thank our other title sponsor, the Well Coffee House, which turns coffee into water and has a mission to bring clean water to the world. Today's news presented by Sutherland & Belk, a Nashville-based injury law firm. Sutherland & Belk is committed to fighting for those who've been injured in car, motorcycle, and truck accidents. Check them out at sbinjurylaw.com. Vanderbilt wins a national title, 8-2 over Michigan in Game 3 of the College World Series Finals. Pitcher Kumar Rocker selected the most outstanding player of the College World Series. Catcher Philip Clark, third baseman Austin Martin, and right fielder J.J. Bleday made the all-tournament team. The Commodores finished the season an incredible 59-12, winning the SEC tournament, and the whole thing in Omaha. LSU in 2009, the last SEC team to do all three, and Vanderbilt finished with the better record than the Tigers did that year. Our guest line today brought to you by Boll & Branch, which was started by Vanderbilt graduates Scott and Missy Tannen. I've slept on these sheets for years. Hate being home from Omaha in a way, but I'll tell you one thing that I loved was getting to sleep on Boll & Branch sheets again, which I did not do for about a week and a half. Their sheets are incredibly comfortable. They are fair trade certified, which means they're made under safe conditions by men and women who were treated and paid fairly. Try them for a month. You can return them for free, but you're not going to want to. Once you get the sheets, get the mattress. That was voted the best mattress of 2018. Go to bollandbranch.com. That's spelled B-O-L-L. Enter the promo code Vandy. Get $50 off your first set of sheets. Chip Fridrich joins us now. He is back fresh from Omaha, or at least back from Omaha. We were talking about this off podcast. That was a long, exhausting trip. I'm still sort of recovering from it. We left Omaha about 11 after Tuesday night, drove to Kansas City, got in about 1 in the morning. We hit the road about probably 8:15 the next morning, left the hotel in KC. I was doing a radio show by about 8:30, and then I drove home most of the rest of the way. My wife and I split time and got back to Nashville. Really, I think the top of the second is about the time we pulled into the garage. It's about 800 miles round trip. It's a little less than that, maybe 750, but it was an exhausting trip. I'm sure it was for you as well. You did it a little differently. There was some flying involved with you to Kansas City. I'm sure you were equally exhausted, but boy, what a trip. And the memories from that will be memories we will not forget anytime soon, Chip Fridrich.
Oh, yeah, Chris. It was an amazing trip, and fresh, as you mentioned, fresh. Fresh is not the word. Back, but not fresh. It feels like, I had this discussion at the team hotel with some parents and some former players I played with. It almost feels like, and I remember back in 2014 when I attended the National Championship Series, which we won against Virginia. It feels like two separate tournaments, which in a way it was. I mean, the first part, the Louisville game and the opening games that we had in this tournament bracket play seemed like a month ago. I mean, when you're out there, and I can only imagine those who stayed for the whole time out in Omaha, which to be praised and lauded for that, because that's an amazing commitment to stay out there financially and as well as just psychologically hanging in there. And you can imagine with the players, it's just a long, enduring several 14 days. You have to be out there with the ceremonies and the attention from the media that goes on, and exhausting doesn't really cover the word as far as what the players probably go to. But what a miraculous, tournament for this team in a season when you look at the whole thing and you package it all together, the breaking school records left and right, and winning 59 games and losing only 12 is pretty amazing. Is more than pretty amazing. So good to be back here, but this is going to be one of those, Chris, that you're going to take a step back several years from now. They'll be talking about this team and what they accomplished, and they will go down in Vanderbilt baseball lore as the greatest team probably as far as a package, what they accomplished and achieved. And kudos to Tim Corbin and staff and the players for putting it all together in a magical season.
I would be interested to know where they rank all time. Now, it's a difficult exercise to do because the tournament format changed, 20 years ago. You've had different eras with the bats and scoring and things like that with the balls. But I would have to think, first of all, college baseball is probably more competitive than ever. And I think sports become harder to win the longer they go. I think sports get more competitive over time, at least the bigger sports, which college baseball is not basketball or football, but it's probably the next thing after those two. But I would have to think this is on the list. And there are different ways you can make lists because a lot of times the best team doesn't win. But if you make a list of national champions, I would have to think this is one of the top teams in the history of the NCAA. If you just take the national champions and say who was the best, I would think this would have to rank probably somewhere in the top quarter at least. Chip, you may have a better perspective on that than I do.
Well, you've got those teams in baseball lore back in when the Omaha, when the popularity of the World Series, the Texas teams and the Florida State teams, and even though they didn't win it, but there were some great baseball teams back then. You had the Oklahoma States of the world, but that was a different era with different bats. And my perspective as far as ranking this team where they accomplished is just the gauntlet that they had to go through, the league that they play in, the fact that they swept conference titles, winning regular season and tournament, the schedule they played, all those factors, and then what they did in the College World Series and as far as the tournament and regional and super regional, you're putting it all together because losing only 12 games and having the RPI they had and the strength of schedule is pretty remarkable. So it's hard to do, Chris. It's hard to compare. You had some really good South Carolina teams that when they had that run, 8, 9, 10 years ago, that was a special team. The LSU teams that have had their success. So I'm sure there could be arguments across the board if you get on any fan base of who is best, because there have been some pretty good teams in this tournament format. So I think it has to be up there with what they had to do as a package. If you packaged it all together, not just what they did when the NCAA tournament started, but what they had to go through, who they had to beat, and the league they had to play. I think they're right up there.
Yeah, if you want to nitpick the schedule a little bit, you can go back to the regular season. You can say, well, they didn't play Ole Miss, they didn't play LSU, they didn't play Mississippi State. All three of those teams got to the Supers at least, and State, of course, got to Omaha. But did beat Ole Miss on a neutral field. Now, granted, Ole Miss's pitching was getting a little worn down compared to Vanderbilt's by the point they played. They beat LSU and beat LSU pretty badly. In the one game they played LSU, and they swept Mississippi State in 2 games. Now, granted, again, neutral field situations, and maybe not. Well, I was going to say the pitching was pretty even when both of them played. So there's that. Even in the teams that they didn't play in the SEC, which they got a favorable schedule compared to the others, you can say, well, the teams they didn't get, they went undefeated against when they played them later. So there's that. I guess you look at the draws in the NCAA tournament. I thought their regional draw was probably a little tougher than they deserved, but it wasn't a terrible draw. It wasn't what Stanford got. In the Super, they caught a break by not catching West Virginia or especially Texas A&M, which beat them earlier. But Duke came to town. Duke was hot. I thought Duke played pretty well, and at least for 2 games, Duke was really competitive till it ran out of pitching. That's a problem that may not have been an issue for Texas A&M, but the Aggies also couldn't hit the ball. And then you get to Omaha. I think that Vanderbilt certainly got the tougher side of the bracket and made it out of that. I think Louisville and Mississippi State were probably at the top of the list of teams that you wouldn't want to face in the tournament. So they got through that undefeated. And you think, well, they catch a break with Michigan. is a 3 seed. Well, we go back and look at that again. I think if you play the season over, Michigan's a team that's good enough to host. I think if you were reseeding the tournament today, certainly Michigan would be in there, and maybe even a national seed. Michigan just didn't play a lot of super tough games, and so we didn't know what they were made of. So anything with the schedule, I think, is nitpicking because on the whole, they played a really tough slate. They played the number 2 overall strength of schedule according to the RPI. It was number 8 according to Boyd's World. So any way you slice it, playing that and going 59-12, I keep going back to this. It's like I look at things and I seem to, like, when I think about this team and what it has accomplished, there were so many things there worth mentioning. I would just be driving along or riding and think of something like, oh, yeah, I didn't think of that. And that's another thing. To go 59-12 against that schedule is just crazy.
Oh, yeah. There's certainly not going to be any asterisks on this team's performance as far as when you look back on it. Well, they didn't play these teams in the SEC. We knew when the schedules were released, that was something that former players and friends of mine pointed out quickly back in whenever that was, in November, December, when those are released. He said, well, you're catching a break here. But the fact that you got them in the SEC tournament and a regional player in the College World Series in Vandy's part, playing Mississippi State the second time, you know, that even though you take some dings in the conference, a 3-game series is certainly different than playing someone once. And if you have to play those teams on the road at their park, they could have taken some licks by playing those teams if they had to. But that's what was rolled out there. They didn't go out and play cream puffs in the early season. They go out west. They do well out there. You know, you certainly, and of course the strength of schedule shows that, as far as how the numbers and stats show, that it was, I think you said, second in the country. So it proves the fact that you can't, in this day and age, you got to go play people and get hardened and calloused as far as your pitching staff and to see good pitchers early on, so nothing surprises you later. And that's what happened to this team, and that's the philosophy that this staff has. So, yeah, I mean, all those things you're saying are true. I mean, I think they did have a little harder regional, and the super regional. Duke was really hot, almost like Duke had kind of a mystique of Michigan. They were very similar. They played hot at the right time of the season and caught fire, much reminiscent of the Vanderbilt team in 2014, as Tim Corbin has alluded to. So, all in all, it proved to be just what the doctor ordered as far as having a schedule that's tough, getting guys ready, and that proved to be the winning formula. You know, your job in writing, and you have message board and people like me who come on here, when you start nitpicking, which we have done, you feel like you're nitpicking, and they win 59 games and you're saying, well, pitching's maybe not front line. You know, it's a great pitching staff. It's maybe this other staff is better than Vanderbilt staff slightly. And you start picking at guys going to a little slump who are batting .430 and they dip, 20 points, and everyone starts worrying. Well, when the expectations are that high, that's what's going to happen. That's what happens to Alabama's football fan base when they only beat Citadel 42-0 instead of 59-0. And when looking back on it, taking a couple steps back, these guys performed admirably, of course, and did what they had to do to win the national title.
Yeah, that's the weird thing about covering a team like this. I just have seen teams, I think, that get crushed by the weight of the expectations, and it's a long season. It's a grind. You're going through class and right up until the SEC tournament almost, and so that burden gets lifted, but it's there most of the year. It gets hot. You played a lot of games. You're probably battling through injuries and fatigue and things like that, which I know that that's the case other schools too, but I think at Vanderbilt, the pressures are more intense. But the thing that is interesting is like you said, you do nitpick everything because the bar has been set so high. To do that and to be so consistent and to not at some point get at least temporarily crushed under the weight of that, I think that of all the remarkable things that they did this year, that was at or near the top of the list.
Yeah, and you get to the point when this team, if you look at segments of this season, undoubtedly when the team went through the run in the SEC, it was, mid-April, early April, when they just ran roughshod over the conference, and you had that 1-2 punch of Martin and Blade leading off every game, and it seemed like they were, they had the 72-hour time period where they were scored 20 runs or more in 2 different games, and just, balls flying out of the park, and it didn't matter if they were playing at home or the road, and they were midweek. You take a snapshot of this team when they played their best baseball was probably that early April, mid-May, when they just blazed through the conference. And can you say that they were playing better then than they were at the end of the season? Probably, just because the bats were so much more noticeable. But as you know, and anyone who follows baseball knows, you get to the tournament, it's a different ball game. You got frontline pitchers you're facing almost every time. And, it proved to be just enough. You worried about, are certain guys going to run out of gas on the pitching staff? And you saw some fluctuation with the rotation when Kumar Rocker kind of surpassed Patrick Raby as far as his role, and started asking yourself, how is that going to affect Raby? And is Mason Hickman going to replace him? And just all those things that you're thinking physically and psychologically about how this team's going to respond. And it turns out in Omaha that the bats cooled down, and your worry was, is the pitching going to be able to hold this team together while the bats were cooled off? And it just got enough, again, of a wonderful 2 performances by Kumar Rocker, who held it together for them just in time for them to have a nice little run there in the 3rd game of the championship series and get it done. But that's a baseball season in kind of retrospect that you look at, and you all teams go through different ebbs and flows. And this team had definitely some ebbs and flows that, offensively, when they were really clicking that April time period, and they had just enough to hold it together to win the championship this past week.
Chip, I'm going to go ahead and go to the mailbag since we've got about 10 questions. And our mailbag is sponsored by Vanderbilt fan and independent insurance agent Josh Minton of Brentwood. Are you in the market for auto, motorcycle, home, renters, or landlord insurance? What about life or commercial insurance? You can call Josh at 615-933-1979. Email him at josh@hqinsurance.com. Follow him on Facebook at facebook.com/JDMintonHQ. He's my insurance agent. Hope you'll make him yours. This is a great question for you because, of course, as people who've listened to the podcast know, you played at Vanderbilt in the late 80s and early 90s, and you have followed this program over that span probably like nobody else. View Titan says, what would you have said if someone came to you in 1999 and stated that 20 years later Vanderbilt would win 2 national championships in baseball?
Well, Chris, I had an opportunity to, when Tim Corbin was hired, and I met with him. There was a small group of us right after he got hired, and in that process, I remember I was up at McGugin Center, and there was about a half a dozen of us who met with him, and I was included in that group. And I knew the guy was special. I knew things were going to be different. I knew that he brought something to the table that had been lacking, and I played for Roy Mewburn, who Coach Mewburn was a long time had a reputation in this country of baseball knowledge, but he did not have any administrative support. Now, they built the stadium under his tenure, and he kind of got that done. And then when the ball was pushed across the goal line, they kind of decided to hand it off to Tim Corbin. But Tim's a different guy. Thinks differently, acts differently, talks differently, mannerisms. I mean, I knew the minute I met with him, spent 5 minutes with him, that things were going to be totally different. And with the administrative support, he already had the stadium. A lot of people think that Tim was responsible for the stadium, and that's to be corrected. He wasn't. I mean, he wasn't around. The stadium was built before he got here. And that was probably the first and foremost thing that needed to happen to attract the players to get here. But I think just the fact that they hired him and it was a little magic in the bottle really started the wheels going. And I think Tim said it perfectly, that things led to another thing, and they all attached through his tenure here of 17, 18 years, that if one thing didn't happen, then the next wouldn't have happened. If they hadn't have hadn't have had the Worth Scott home run against Tennessee and started that chain of events, that they made the SEC tournament, got some publicity, and they hadn't have had the David Prices of the world come, and they all connected. So for me, I knew that special things were going to happen because of his presence. And I hate to put it on just one person, but it really is. I mean, he changed the culture of the program from a guy who didn't get coached by him. I in a unique way, I feel like I've been coached by him. You hear a lot of other players who he is welcomed into the program. He didn't even play for him feel that way. He takes you in. He took in the former players. And you know what, Chris? He didn't have to do that. He did not have to. The previous pre-Tim Corbin players, he could have just, it would have been very easy for him to say, you know what, this is my program. I'm going to, all those guys, but I respect you guys, but I'm going to do it. And he didn't do that. And he welcomed all those former players in. But yeah, I knew right away. I did not, to answer the question bluntly, I don't think at any time that anyone thought 2 national championships in this time period that we've had, and trips to Omaha and super regionals and all those things, and SEC tournament championships. I thought they were going to be different, and I thought there were going to be trips to the NCAA tournament. But to say that 2 national titles are on the horizon, I would have not said you're crazy, but I would have said, boy, those are lofty dreams. And now it seems like here in the last 10 years, it's become a commonplace that Vanderbilt teams end up in Omaha.
It's funny, Chip. Of course, I grew up in a family of Vanderbilt fans, so I went to games. In baseball and basketball, we didn't miss many games when I was a kid and even into college and after. And I was a baseball fan, but not a college baseball fan. I remember, I think this was the summer of 1998. My best friend got some tickets cheap to the College World Series in Rosenblatt, said, hey, let's take a road trip. I said, great. So we went out there, saw about half the College World Series. I didn't even know how it worked at the time, but I had such a great time at that. I remember thinking, man, what if Vanderbilt baseball ever got here? How weird would that be? But it was just kind of a passing thought and not something that I ever thought that might actually happen. And fast forward a few years later, I was around 2002, kind of passively making a bid to get into sports writing through some other venues, and I got randomly asked to start the Rival site. I mean, it was way over my head. I was woefully underqualified, and I guess out of time just arguably grew into it. But anyway, that's another story. But I remember in 2003, my first year doing this, we were just doing football and basketball. And being that I was a baseball guy at heart, I thought, well, that would be fun to cover. And so I remember going to the last game, the Worth Scott game against Tennessee, and sitting in the stands and watching it. And so that was the only game that I saw that year, other than I did watch the tournament on TV. And I thought, okay, I'm going to make it a point the next year to cover them, just like I do the other sports, get credentials and all that. And so I emailed Vanderbilt, said I would like to sit down with Tim and meet him and just tell him who I am and do an interview. And so I remember I pull into the Magoogan parking lot, and the minute I pull in, Tim pulls in as well. And he already knows who I am, and he greets me by name. We'd never met face to face. And I go in his office, which is a fraction of the size of the one that he has now, and everything in there is neat. There's not a speck of dust. Everything is arranged at right angles. It would have been like, it's like he'd had an interior designer in there and a maid right before we met. And I just like, this guy is so on top of stuff. I was just thinking, I think this guy is going to do big things. And then comes '04 and they get to the regional. And at that point you feel like, okay, he's going to make this thing into something big. And it took longer, I think, than most of us expected. Because I think back in '04, by the time he was assembling those classes, you saw that '07 team. You just thought, this is the magical team. It's the team of destiny. And it didn't happen like that. So it was kind of weird because it starts with the bang, but then there's that 7-year drought where they get to Omaha between '04 and '11, where I think even he was wondering, are we ever going to make it? To see this from start to finish, and you had another layer of it that I didn't have. there's incredible, I don't think is even the word. It's something beyond that.
Yeah, and Sonny Gray mentioned yesterday, I heard Sonny Gray when we pulled in off the plane, he got off the plane and turned on the radio. Corbin was on the air with Willie Donick, and Sonny Gray called in. He was the mystery guest. They had him on, and Gray had a great comment that I think was very poignant. And of course, I didn't have the career anywhere near Sonny Gray. But Gray's comment was, I feel just a part of the program, just as much a part of the program now as I was as I felt when I was a member of the team, when I was wearing the uniform. And he said, Tim Corbin makes it that way. And he mentioned yesterday that, the term VandyBoys, there's some people at first when that came out and they kind of trademarked it or hashtag, but on Twitter and social media, the VandyBoys, and some kind of thought, well, that's kind of corny and what does that mean and all that. And I think there was some derision from SEC fan bases, the VandyBoys theme, but they took that and developed it to a theme and a culture that once you're a Vandy boy, you're always a Vandy boy. And Tim Corbin alluded to that yesterday, talking about anyone being a part of this program as part of their culture from way back when to the current. It's a funny story. I was some former players who I haven't seen in years, I saw in Omaha, and we were talking about the street cred that one gets from having played baseball at Vanderbilt from especially young people, because they don't know any different. I mean, if you're a 10-year-old, you think that if you played at Vanderbilt, you played pro ball or you won a national title or Vanderbilt's always been good. And that's not been the case. But the street cred that you get from being a former player back in 2014, when I was out in Omaha for that series when we won it against Virginia, a kid came up to me and the father said, well, Chip played baseball at Vanderbilt. He looked at me and he said, are you a Vandy boy? And I kind of nodded my head. Well, yeah, I played. He said, can I have your autograph? And that's just part of it, that the chuckle that we have, that if they'd only known the place where we played was a sandbox and was the ridicule of the conference. And now they play in this majestic park that's great, and they win national titles. So it's kind of an inside joke with us that our level of respect around the country, I guess, when you see people and they found out you played baseball there, is great. And that's because of the culture that he's created and his staff and players that he's taken that theme of Vandy Boys, that you're part of this group that thinks alike, acts alike, and does the things the right way and plays the game the right way and says the right things and acts in public the right way. And it's a tribute to his system. Now, it's not for everybody. It is certainly not for everybody. And there have been players who have lasted 3 months. There have been players who have lasted a year and don't like it and don't want to buy into it. And that's okay, because there's enough that will. And I think that goes a long way to what he's accomplished, and it's a testament to his staff, he and his staff.
Yeah, the culture around that program, I'm continually amazed by. And I think that's one thing that attracted me to covering them, is I felt like I was watching something special that nobody knew about. It's the way that he knew my name before I'd even met him. It's the way that he treated people. And look, Tim's not perfect. Tim's got a temper. Tim will tell you there's been times he's not managed things. But the effort and the planning and the detail that go behind everything, the way his kids treat people, it's really amazing, because I feel like for a long time, Chip, we felt like we were watching an undiscovered gem. I felt that back. Now, in 2007, that kind of got them on the radar. They were a great story locally, but then they just kind of fell off. And even when I went to Omaha in 14 and 15, the media contingent was me. And in 2014, it was Nick Cole, who was working for the Tennessee, and he was the temporary guy between Jeff Lockridge and Adam Sparks. And then the next year, I think it was me and Adam in 2015. Of course, I couldn't stay the whole time, but there was not a TV presence out there. There was not a radio presence out there. From the Vanderbilt end, it was their media relations guy, Kyle Parkinson. I think that was it. They borrowed my photographer. I feel like for whatever reason, and maybe it was partly the Donnie Everett story, I'm sure Kumar Rocker and his emergence hurt or significantly helped too, but I could not believe it when I got out there. I bet you Vanderbilt alone brought maybe a dozen people in media relations and marketing. It may have been more than that. I don't know that I saw all of them. So there was that. I think from the Vanderbilt end, boy, congratulations to them, and a shout out to Andrew Pate, their media relations guy. They have a lot of good ones over there. Andrew is one of the nicest human beings I've ever encountered. And the poor guy, I saw him yesterday. He just looked worn out. But the effort that they put in on that end was remarkable. It was stunning to see how much it had changed even in 3 or 4 years. And again, I think that goes back to Malcolm Turner, and I think that goes back to the hit they took in the media in August. But the other thing was the local media. I know that it was me, it was Adam, Joe Rexroad was out there for the final. I saw Tatum Everett and Kayla Anderson, TV guys. I saw Steve Lehman out there. I saw Kevin Ingram out there for the final series. I feel like I'm missing some people, but I had never seen the local media turn out to Omaha the way it did. Between that and Vanderbilt, it was phenomenal how much coverage they got and how good it was.
Oh yeah, and I'll second your notion about their media relations. I mean, and their social media presence. I mean, you would have the team would leave the hotel at 3:30 for batting practice, and there'd be cameras all over the place videoing, and then there'd be a video out 15 minutes later, Chris. There'd be a video out with music, and it already been edited, and that's the world we live in today. I mean, everything's now, and you get it out, but just the presentations that they've done. I thought Brandon Barker was really good, several years ago, and I'm not sure where he is now, but everybody was just, when he left, was, oh, this is awful, we're losing it. I mean, they've added to that what he did, and it is remarkable how the productions that he put on through Facebook and Twitter and emails that they send out, and the fact that they kept people who were there in Omaha apprised of activities there, and it just was it was a I'm not saying it's a breath of fresh air, because it's kind of been this rumbling the last several years of growing, but what they did out there was extremely impressive. I mean, and you're talking about a program 17, 20 years ago didn't even have every game on the radio. I mean, Willie Donick and I were the first radio broadcasters of that team right before Tim got hired, and to where it's grown of having only select game. We didn't do every game. We did just conference games, and to where it's the social media presence is now every game's on the radio, TV people out there, as you mentioned, all the productions they did is just, it's a night and day difference. And those guys and gals are to be commended for all their efforts.
Yeah, like you said, the quality of the work was tremendous too. By the way, shout out to Zach Ellis. I saw he tweeted out he's leaving. I've not seen him.
Sure.
Said he's going into private business. Zach did a phenomenal job at Vanderbilt. And speaking of Barca, he's working in private business here. I think he's in PR with a local firm. I did see him before one of the super regional games at Duke. Brandon's just one of my all-time favorite people over there, not just for the work he put in. I think Brandon was wearing himself out too. I think that was one of those things that maybe if they'd had more help and more people, Brandon would still be there. But he got a job offer at the University of Oregon where Vanderbilt just kind of let him go back in the in the days that just a year or two ago, right, where they were just, I said the athletic program was drifting. And I think that's what the first 3 years of the podcast that I did, I was very critical of them, and it was all deserved. But I think part of it was I saw how Corbin ran his operation, and that to me was a blueprint of what they could be. I think it's really good to see the rest of the AD seemingly trying to catch up to that example.
Yeah, I agree. And it's nice. I think Malcolm Turner gets it. He comes from that world of having to get the message out from the G League and promoting your program and your league when he was in the league, that league. And doing that, and I think he gets it wholeheartedly. I want to add a tidbit when we were talking about social media, and something you and I didn't talk about previously, but I thought it was the strangest. And I'm not trying to be an old fogey here. This is just how times have changed. And if any of your listeners of the podcast were in Omaha, maybe they were taking part of it and didn't realize it because of the culture we're in, as far as Twitter and Facebook and filming on your phone. But the final 3 outs in Omaha that we got was the strangest 5 minutes I've ever been a part of in sport. One of them, because it was so quiet. Everyone, and normally that you had this fan base that was clapping, and you had the whistler, and you had cheers and constant, VU and all that throughout the entire game for 8 innings. And then so you have this 9th inning where you think that the fan base would be rabid and there'd be staccato clapping and it was quiet. And so I'm sitting there I had really good seats, fortunately, on about the 4th row, and I'm clapping and trying to get, kind of like being the fan, and no one was clapping. And it was almost like you were watching circus animal. This event was going on. And I realized as I turned around and I turned to my son, I said, look at all the phones. Everyone had their phone out videoing, so they couldn't clap. I bet there were thousands of phones out. And in a moment, I just thought it was funny how the world has changed, where you go to concerts and everybody's got their phone out and you're not taking in the moment. And I'm not saying it was bad. I'm just saying this is the world we live in, that here in this moment, your team's getting ready to win a national title. And there was no clapping. It was quiet, and you could hear people talking. And when the game finally, the culmination, I took a video of I finally took my phone out, and I said, well, I'm just going to join them, but I wanted to get my kids' reaction. So I took the final out, and then I panned to my 2 boys who were going crazy and jumping up and down. And I'm so thankful I captured that moment. But it was almost like this delayed reaction of exultation, because everybody couldn't use their hands and they were so busy focused on filming it for their phone, which, again, I'm not saying that's just the world. Again, you go to any concert, you go to an event, that happens, but it was just a weird final 5 minutes where it really wasn't loud in that park. And if you watch the replay of it, you see what I mean. It was thousands of phones out trying to capture that moment.
Yeah, it was weird. I didn't think about that element, but it was almost anticlimactic. It was kind of like, okay,
Sure.
They got scared, and then Rocker got them through, and you felt like they were in good shape, not great shape, heading into Game 3, because Michigan had Kaufman, but it was kind of like, okay, after the 5th or 6th inning, you kind of felt like nothing's a sure thing, but I think everybody would have been shocked if Michigan had come back. It lacked that euphoria that you had in 2014, where one swing of the bat, even down to the last pitch, can change the game. So it was a little weird. And even watching on TV at home, it was a little anticlimactic.
Yeah, and you've won it once, but none of those guys had won it. I mean, none of those guys, except the coaching staff, had been a part of that, what happened in 2014. But it's just, again, just a sign of the times. Not saying it was bad. It's what everyone wants to capture that, and they've got these devices in their pocket that have so many pixels in it, and they work just as good as a camera did, a $5,000 camera 10 years ago. But I just kind of thought that was interesting to point out. I was thinking that it was going to be real rabid, and it was actually pretty quiet.
Yeah, the other thing before we get back to the mailbag, I thought that the national media coverage of them was phenomenal. I think that ESPN did a great job with the College World Series. I think the SEC Network, and go back to Hoover, I think those guys did an unbelievable job. In fact, I think their baseball coverage now is good or better than their coverage in anything else. I think Kyle Peterson, Ben McDonald, Chris Burke, all those guys do an incredible job of not just covering the game, but explaining it and walking you through the situations. I think Aaron Fitt and Kendall Rogers at D1 Baseball, Teddy Cahill did a great job. Aaron, I think, especially did a really good job. I felt bad for Aaron. Aaron kind of got attacked by that fan base for saying, hey, I have my doubts about their strike throwing, but Aaron was dead on. That was the one thing, and you saw it in game one, that kind of came back to bite them. When you can't command your stuff, that's when Michigan took that 1-0 lead after game one. But that was just an aside, too. I just think that the coverage in the national media for that game continues to get better. And I think that's one reason I think it can grow, is I think that when you're watching it alongside people who understand and follow the game, because that wasn't always the case. And even back in 2014 and maybe 15, you kind of felt like ESPN just kind of threw guys out there that knew baseball but weren't that familiar with the college game. I feel like that has changed quickly.
Yeah, all those guys do a great job. And, of course, you got to remember the SEC networks coming to fruition during that time period has just built up the fan base as far as people watching it and keeping up with it. And they have their own crews out there. But those guys do a really good job of the production. And you look at it, their job is to attach themselves to someone. Of course, Kumar Rocker is going to be if they showed a picture of him just in the dugout in game 3, they showed it once, they showed it 10 times. And he was the first person they showed when the teams ran out on the field for the dog pile. They followed Kumar Rocker. I mean, he obviously deserves that attention, and that's what they do. They focus on one or two objects because they know he's going to be someone who's going to be pitching in the big league soon, and they want to attach themselves. But goodness knows we're lucky to have him for 2 more years, and we'll take that, and they can give him all the media attention they want. But he's going to be a Vandy boy for 2 more years.
Okay, back to the mailbag. Dusty Orleans says, and this is a good question. I'm glad this was asked because I wanted to circle back to it. I feel kind of bad. Here we are Friday, and the last podcast we did was Monday, so we've kind of left our audience hanging with that. What were they doing with the pitching podcast we did? But it is what it is, just the travel schedules and everything. This is the first time we could really get together. So Dusty Orleans says, interesting choice bringing Raby in due to his lack of performance previously, and he cites the numbers we mentioned last podcast. Says, do you think Corbin had the feeling Vanderbilt could lose game 2 but only win game 3? By that I mean, was he willing to accept not winning game 1 if it helped us have better quality and depth to pitch games 2 and 3? I think he's potentially on to that a little bit some, but you and I learned a little something about the podcast we did Monday that played into the pitching decision, and I'll just let you explain. I've heard this other places too, but I'll let you kind of give your own words to this one.
Well, I just think that, and I think I said this in the podcast, Patrick Raby, I think they had their mind up that when there wasn't going to be another pitcher after him, he pitched the final frame, and when it got separated there, they knew that this was going, in their mind, it would have to be a 3-game series. So they didn't want to burn any arms going forward in the rest of that game. So I think they had their made up, and coaches have different things in the back of their mind as far as, okay, if this scenario happens, we're going with 2 or 3 of these guys as far as who are pitching or stable full pitchers are going to be. But yeah, I think that when there was no need to burn arms in game 1, and Raby, I think, was going to pitch that if it got to be 8, 9, 10 run deficit from Michigan, away from Michigan. So yeah, I think you had to do that, and I think Michigan kind of had to do that themselves in game 2. They didn't burn any arms either. You didn't have Bakic burning 2 of his better arms in that scenario. So anybody who thought this thing was going to go, I mean, a 2-game sweep is very unlikely these days with the parity and the power arms that are out there. Everybody's got a horse that they ride. And I think that was the case. That you just can't sit there and just throw it. Now, Michigan did throw a bunch of arms in game 2 when the league got separated, but you didn't see 2 of their better ones that they held back for game 3. And I know Bakic on his end maybe caught a little grief and people scratching their heads of why he didn't just go for the juggler there in game 2. But you have, it's all about matchups, and you had Rocker going, who was undoubtedly Vanderbilt's best pitcher. And that it's not gamesmanship, it's just strategy. Who the other team's pitching and how you think your best chance to win 2 games. That's all it is. You got to win 2 games. And I think that's what happened with Bakic's strategy, and Tim Corbin and Scott Brown's as well.
Well, and I think, to be more specific, I think that Ethan Smith was sort of sidelined for whatever reason. I don't think there was like a major injury, but they think they're trying to be careful. So that sort of affected what they could do. No, they did have Eder. And I think I would have gone to Eder in that spot before either King or Raby. But what it did, and now we know this, and maybe Vanderbilt would have played it differently. I don't think it would have changed. It turned out to be a good thing because what that did is maybe it wouldn't have changed Eder's availability for Wednesday between Monday, but it certainly left him fresh and able to finish out that game. So I think it turned out well. The other underrated thing in that was Drake Fellows was able to go into the 5 2/3 innings, which I know he didn't pitch well, but you go back and look at that, and let's say they pull him in the second inning, that changes the dynamic of your pitching for the rest of the series. So in hindsight, yeah, maybe at the time both of us might have done some things differently. Mine would have been Eder, but ended up working out really well.
Yeah, and you didn't want to put my thoughts on Game 3 were, I said this before the game, I don't think you would have seen anybody who hadn't been out there already was not going to get the ball. And I was thinking all along it was going to be Hickman, Eder, Brown to close and get 3 outs. And it didn't really surprise. I think he just let Eder finish the game. Brown had thrown, I think, 40 pitches the previous game to get the save. And I didn't think anybody else was going to get the ball in that Game 3 who hadn't been out there. Of course, you had Zach King, who threw an inning or so in Game 1. I could have seen him getting maybe a batter or two. But I think putting anybody else out there on Game 3 in the national stage with so much to play for, I think they was already made up their mind that those were the guys. Eder had already been out there in a pressure situation, has done well, and I was impressed with his performance. So I think that it played out well. Those things are those chess games that someone doesn't follow baseball all that much wouldn't necessarily get, but it does go on. They play through those scenarios. They've got them on their charts as far as who they would use in what situations based on matchups, and it worked out for the Commodores in this case.
This one from Ann Arbor Door. So Corbin said everyone was available to play on Wednesday. Could you see a scenario where he would have used Kumar Rocker? If so, and how many pitches? What I presume when Tim meant everybody was available is he meant everybody but Fellows and Rocker. Rocker had thrown 104 pitches. There's no way with his professional future you're going to bring him back. And Fellows had thrown 114 in Game 1. So I think that the way I interpreted that was, well, everybody knows we're not going to use those two, but everybody else is available.
Right. There was no way that Kumar Rocker was going to pitch. There was no that Tim and Scott Brown. I think it was probably just he meant that in a general sense, but everybody who knew anything about pitching or I know that Eric Bakich knew he wasn't going to see those two guys. He knows Tim too well. So I think he meant anybody and everybody other than those two.
Okay, a few more questions sort of pertaining to this year before we move on to some with next year. Door King says UCLA was the number 1 national seed, obviously didn't get it done. Who really is the better team?
Oh, I think Vanderbilt was a better team. I'm almost glad they weren't the number 1 team. I think that just puts a little more pressure and gave them a little more motivation. I just think this team at their best, when they were in that mid-April we've talked about, early May, rolling teams up, and the pitching staff that was doing an admirable job, and you had Kumar Rocker's rise, I think they were better than UCLA. I just do. I think even though UCLA played some stiff competition early and played in a good league, I think Vanderbilt played in a better league and with in front of bigger crowds, and they were battle-tested. And I just think Vanderbilt was a better team. I don't think it was I don't think it was necessarily a fluke that Michigan beat UCLA. They beat them on their home field. And, this is a team that was an at-large coming into their park and taking care of them at their home park. So I think Vanderbilt, when it's all said and done, the dust settled. And I didn't see what were the final, in my busy time to get home yesterday, what did UCLA end up in the final poll?
I want to say 6, which I think is too low. I think those final polls are tough to do because
it's hard.
Yeah, I don't know how you weigh. This is the way I kind of wish somebody would do the poll. is like if you were saying, okay, we're going to play another turn. I guess you make the number one team because it has to be. But other than that, I'd kind of like to see them say, okay, if we were starting over and playing another season starting today, how would you rank the teams 1 to 25? I think that's a more fair way to do it because Auburn ended up at number 9, and I understand why. But come on, Auburn was not the 9th best team in the country.
No, not at all. And it's hard to do. It's just like, it's all subjective as far as how that works. Is, you know, you have to see the teams, and someone in Idaho trying to do that. I don't know who does the polls, but if they have voters, but it's someone who doesn't follow it year round and goes to games and goes to super regionals and sees these teams, I don't know how they could come up with it. But yeah, that's a difficult poll to do. But answering the question, though, I think the best team in the country was Vanderbilt when they were playing. You know, you play Vanderbilt and UCLA in a 3-game series. I think Vanderbilt beats them, but that's all for all the people to guess and see what would happen in kind of the fantasy world.
Dorfan says odds on DeMarco and Clark returning, not combined odds, but individually. Context for that, of course, both those guys were draft-eligible sophomores. DeMarco went round 17 to the Yankees. Clark went round 9 to the Blue Jays. What I keep hearing, Chip, is that Clark is probably the higher probability, but that's speculation and hearsay. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I've heard different things. I heard that DeMarco, the pull of the Yankees is a team that he's followed, and now I think it's his second time he's been drafted by the Yankees, if I'm correct. Not sure, but I know it's a team. He's a childhood team that he follows, and being from that area, it's going to be tough. But the 17th round money is a whole lot different than 6th, 7th, 8th round money. And Clark's, I would like to think, and just talking to people, I think Philip Clark is going to be a big league catcher one day. He's a tough kid, man. He is. Two of my boys were in the car driving back and said, "Daddy, who's your favorite baseball player on the team?" And we went back and forth. And Steven Scott and Philip Clark are my guys who I just love watching because they're multi-sport athletes. High school, they're tough kids. They grind. They don't give in when they're hitting. I think he's got great hands at the plate, Clark, and an incredible arm. My wish, I guess, and we're dealing with money here and future and all those things, is that he could get a 4th round next year with a big year and still have leverage being a junior instead of a 9th round. And the money is a difference between that 4th and 9th round. But I do have no idea, no inside information about what they're thinking. This is a time of year, Chris, where it's really, really strange. And Corbin talks about even though he wins the last game of the year and they won it, there's only one team standing. It's the automobile wreck that's slammed into the wall of saying goodbye to people. And that's got to be a hard thing. And they're going through that right now. You got players who are going to the Cape, and you got players who are going to other leagues and the Rhode Island League. And I don't think we have anybody playing in Alaska, but just the various summer leagues and Team USA and you're trying to figure out, you've been a selfless player for the last 7 months or 8 months, trying to, ever since those fall workouts and the season you went through and the grind. And now you win a national championship, and now it becomes a selfish decision in a way. What can I do for my family and myself? Am I going to get another opportunity next year? Is the opportunity going to be better than this year's opportunity? Do I have leverage? Do I not have leverage with, as far as a club, leveraging myself as far as getting more money? And it's a weird thing. It's a strange situation that you go from being selfless to selfish in a way, and you have to do that way. And some of these kids, they've been thinking about this since they were 11 and 12 years old of playing pro ball. And I've said this in a podcast before. It's, you don't program them. You get in the culture and they learn to be teammates and they learn the VandyBoy way. But in the back of these kids' minds, they got to look out for what's best for them. And they've been thinking about doing this and dreaming about this and the travel ball and showcases for years, and their parents getting in cars and driving all night to these showcases and singing in front of scouts and for this moment. And when the money calls or that chance calls, you've got to make that split second decision if you're going to take it or not. So these two kids, and not only these two kids, but some others, many others, have got this choice to make. And it's hard because you're just this euphoria, and then all of a sudden your phone starts ringing the next day, and it's your agent or your advisor or these teams and these player representatives from these representatives from these pro teams are pressuring you to, I need an answer. Here's our number. What do you think? And it's a difficult thing to go through, and it takes a lot of maturity to go through it. And hopefully these kids will be well informed to make that choice, because it is a tough one that they have to make.
Well, and shout out to Philip Clark too. My wife went to one game and took our children. I've got a son who's 5, and our daughter turned 8 on Monday on the trip. So we went to game 2 of the championship game. I was in the press box. They were in the stands. They were sitting down the right field foul line, pretty deep towards the foul pole. And I don't know exactly how it unfolded, but she sent me a picture probably 45 minutes before the game. Philip Clark came over and took a photo with the kids. Of course, he had a home run later in that game. So I think the kids appreciate it, but that is kind of cool because one day I'll be able to show them that photo and say, hey, you guys may not remember this, but you took this photo with him. And, especially if he ends up being a big leaguer, that'll be neat. But, for him to get a photo with them on the game that he hit a home run, I thought was neat. And that kid, I don't know him well at all, just have interacted with him a little bit in media circles, but just kind of a guy that I like and respect too.
Yeah, and Clark, being a local kid, you're not sure how much that plays into it, that, maybe someone from New York or Massachusetts or out of town, that being here for another year when he can. But that's the advantage that DeMarco and Clark both have, is it's not like they're juniors and they have that leverage. They really have double leverage. They have this year and next year to go by, since their age, being over 21 before the draft. And we'll just see how that all plays out. I'm sure that the clubs will be wanting to make a quick decision, and I don't see it dragging out either one of them. I'll tell you that much. I think it'll probably be sooner rather than later for both of them.
And Arbiter says, are either of you hearing who we might have in Team USA this summer? I think that question's been answered. I think it's Tyler Brown, Austin Martin, and Kumar Rocker are all going to play for Team USA.
Yeah, and McDonald, the Louisville coach, is the coach. And I just saw a tweet earlier this morning. I think they're having some inter-squad games, a red versus blue game, because I saw a tweet of a lineup card. So those guys, you talk about the exhaustion of being in a tournament. You got those 3 guys joining that team, not sure where they are right now. I think they go maybe to North Carolina to train. I'm not sure. It used to be Millington in West Memphis, above Memphis, north of Memphis for years, but I think it's in like North Carolina before they go and play their international series that they go across country. So I knew Austin Martin. I'd heard some rumblings about him being a part of that team. Rocker, I think, was going to play in the Cape, and that's changed now. He'll be on the Team USA team. And so that's 3 good choices there. Tyler Brown also being added. So great to get that international exposure and experience.
Wonders says, what is the prospectus for next year's team and the odds to get back to Omaha?
It's so hard to get back. I'm running into people out there, just Omaha people. They're like, we'll see you next year. And those kind of comments you get from the concession workers and the gate people and the people at the hotel. And it is extremely difficult to get out there. And it's just the grind you got to go through. So, as I told my boys late night, we were up at way past their bedtime at 12 o'clock midnight after they won it all. I said, guys, this is, soak this in. You never know when you're going to get back, and it's difficult to get back. But this team, I think the holes, Chris, obvious holes are going to be shortstop and then catcher, if depending on what Clark does. They've got enough flexibility with people coming in. They can move people around. You wonder if Austin Martin's going to go to the outfield. If Gonzalez gets a chance at first or third, I think second base is pretty much, a Harry Rays to lose. They've got, Cooper Davis, who we've seen just forgotten. The guy started 20-plus games this year, and hopefully he'll be back healthy. So there's a lot of as I mentioned to some people on the way back, this team, half the team could turn over with draft picks, people leaving early, people leaving on their own decision, graduation. But what they have of the half, a little less than half probably, but as far as the dress out row, the 35 man, with enough coming in with a heralded freshman class, I think they're going to have the pitching punch to get there. They're going to need to develop their bullpen a little more and fill those holes that, obviously there's a hole at first, but I think you got some guys who can plug that. The shortstop is a question mark because it's right up the middle. You build your team. A lot of teams say catcher, pitcher, shortstop, center field. You build it that way and branch out. So shortstop's going to be a battle, and the catching, depending on what Clark does, it'd be a whole lot better if he comes back. But getting back there, I think they'll have every opportunity. We'll see who they have to play in the schedule in the conference, who they play and they don't play. But I think this train is rolling, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. The exposure they have with recruits being on the national stage is only going to help them. But it really depends on, Corbin was asked, when did he know that this team had the magic? And he said, when December rolled around, workouts were over with, and they said it was just a quiet group that went about their way and worked hard. Their grades were good. No one got any trouble. There wasn't any activity outside the team that was having them lose their focus. So for me to sit here and say, well, yeah, they're going to do it, I don't think even Corbin and staff know they're going to do it until you kind of figure out how special your team is right before it starts in December. And I think that'll be the case for the 2020 campaign.
There's a story that comes to mind, and it'll make sense when I'm done with it. I feel like everything you said is true about it being tough to get to Omaha, and even for great teams, that can be the case. You can ask UCLA or 2007 Vanderbilt or any number of teams that we could cite. But I'm reminded, when we were kids, we went to a lot of Sounds games, and I think the first year they were here was 78. We went to several games that year, and my dad took my brother and I, we were just little kids at the time, to a game. And I think the first game we ever went to, he caught a foul ball. And this was at the time when they were getting, probably 8,000 and 10,000 people a night because they were the only game in town, and people were just crazy over them. And so we're on the way home, and Dad's telling us about, this is a special thing. You don't get to experience that much. I went to all kinds of games as a kid and never got a foul ball, so don't get your hopes up. So, of course, what happens? The next game we go to, we get 2.
Yeah, that's great. Great story. Yeah, you don't know. And that's why as parents, and I saw a lot of dads and daughters and dads and sons out there, just even from the Omaha area, that drove miles and miles away, hours and hours away, just to be at those games. Didn't have an affiliation with any team. Talked to several who did, and that makes those times magical. And especially if you've never been, if you're a Vanderbilt fan and you want to go next time they go, it's hard to get to. It's one of the hardest places to get to fly, and it's not easy drive, but it's well worth it to do so.
There are several questions on starting lineups and asking us to project things for next year. So I'm just going to kind of combine these. Dan Bean asked a summary question. Your projected starting lineup and weekday and weekend starters. I will do a podcast later, probably with New York Door, where we go over that in detail. We'll do it after the draft, and that way we don't have to speculate on whether Clark and DeMarco and those guys are going. That will clear it up a little bit. And plus, he also really follows these guys pretty closely. But let's start with pitching. Chip, obviously Rocker and Hickman will be in there, probably Rocker 1, Hickman 2. The third will be interesting. I don't know if they will throw Tyler Brown in there. I think that's what I would be tempted to do. You've got Ethan Smith. You've got any number of talented arms. I think Jack Leiter. Oh, yeah, of course, Eater. I mean, you got so many choices. I think Eater or Brown, probably one of them closes. I would be tempted. You hate to mess with what's working, but I'd be really tempted to move Brown into that spot, one of those spots. Boy, Rocker, Hickman, Brown, I think right there, that's the best 3 they've ever had, if that's what they do. I mean, in either you could make the case too, or even Ethan Smith. It is crazy. Now, I think the question will be with pitching, how they bridge that gap. I think Hugh Fisher, if he gets better with his control and command, maybe he's your closer. He is a guy that I've seen. I saw a mock draft the other day. I don't know how reputable it was, but I think now that I think about it, I think Fangraphs had him in the top 10 draft prospects for next year. I don't know how the roles settle, but next year's pitching could be the most talented they've had yet.
Yeah, I don't know if I would. Brown's a tough one, Chris. I'd almost keep him in that role. I just think he has the mentality for that role right now, and to switch him. I'm not saying he can't do it, and I'm not knocking him that he can't go 6-7 innings deep in the games. But he if they could find a third guy, I think he'd have the ability to really. Look at what he did this year, just to duplicate that role. Now, I'm not sure that's what he wants to do, and I know, of course, and let's just be honest. Tyler Brown is going to have to be, and of course, they're going to do what's best for the team, Brownie and Corbin. But the situation is with his daughter. I mean, next year is a year where it's very important for him, and he's going to go, I would think. I think he would go if it were possible. He'd go this year if the rules allowed it. But just the situation with what he's been through and his family situation. But it would be very tempting to move him to that role of a starter. But gosh, he was so good at doing it this year that if you could get a guy like an Eater, the freshman lighter, if you could get Smith, there were a number of candidates there for that third spot. And that's what fall baseball is all about, what they do this summer, and get some innings under. I think Brown's probably going to be in the closer role for Team USA, so it's not going to change this summer. It's certainly, I don't see him going out there throwing 6-7 innings. It would have to be a switch they would definitely have to make in the fall, and depending on what they wanted to do with him.
The lineup, well, that's tricky. I mean, I'll go through it. Catcher, if either Duvall or Clark come back, or both, then that settles it. If not, they have a couple of freshmen coming in, first of all. And then the kid, I've gone blank. The kid who pinch hit a lot, the freshman from Virginia. Dominic Keegan, who I think has been working out at first.
Right. Keegan, yeah.
I think at first, I'm anxious to see what Malcolm does. He was a highly regarded bat coming in. I think Justin Henry Malloy could be the guy there too. Justin had some tough luck, but he was considered their top bat coming into the season among their freshmen. I think he was the guy that they felt if anybody was going to emerge, it would probably be him. He even got a start at third the first weekend of the year. So I would think that he'd be up there. Your thoughts on catcher and first, and I'll get into the others.
Well, then you wonder if you're going to have a situation, and it all depends on what goes on with Gonzalez, because and Gonzalez has a better chance at first than he does third, of course, if Martin doesn't move to the outfield. And there's just a lot of dominoes out there. If Corbin has joked before that my two best outfielders are in the infield, with Martin and with Harry Ray at second being former outfielders. So I really think he stays with Ray at second just for the experience and leadership role there. So the question becomes, what happens with Austin Martin? Does he go to the outfield? And if that happens, you have two spots for Gonzalez to battle for. But those are going to be, it's a domino situation there. And then, I like Malloy too. I know his bat was something before the season they were counting on. So you've got, maybe Malloy and Gonzalez battling for that spot at first base. And it'll all play out because you never know how the freshmen are going to come in. I do think second base, I don't see them having two newcomers up the middle, at least to start off. I think Harry Ray would stay there unless something just strange happened.
Yeah, I think Ray is the one given at second, and boy, that kid got so much better with the bat and the glove. Third is going to be interesting because I think, like you said, the decision with Martin, it's one of those things like Tyler Brown, it works so well at third late, but I think Tim Corbin has called him their best center fielder, so I think that probably projection at the major league level could play in there, and maybe if they think he's a center fielder, then then that maybe guides their decision to moving him. I think Gonzalez at third, because that kid hit so well when he played and was such a great kid in terms of accepting his role and the fact that he was left out. That's a bat that you get back in the lineup. I think at first, third, maybe DH. Jason Gonzalez has got to be in there somewhere.
Yeah, and he, to think about how crazy that we talked about this. I mean, he hadn't swung a bat in a game, Chris, in what, a month? I mean,
at least, yeah.
I think, yeah, and that's the case. One thing I'll say, and I said this continually, the lineup, you could have just printed it off every day. It was the same thing. There were no changes. There wasn't much pinch hitting, if any. You saw Kiambo Centris base run in the game the other night, but other than that, in game two, it was the same lineup, no deviation, no changing. So a lot of these kids haven't swung a bat in a real game, and I'm sure they did in some simulated games and took a lot of BP when they were practicing. But when they get out there here in the summer league, a lot of these kids hadn't swung a bat against live pitching in a game in a month and a half. So they need to develop as well. You got guys like Isaiah Thomas, who, same thing. He got some starts before DeMarco came back, and he hasn't gotten any opportunities as well, except maybe the Duke game when the game got kind of out of hand in game one. But other than that, they've been silent.
Yeah, I think short, New York Door thinks Carter Young will be the guy. Probably Tate Colwick, I think, will certainly get a look. Colwick could end up being maybe their utility infielder guy that plays in some different spots and relieves some guys. I think in the outfield, Isaiah Thomas is a certainty. I'm just not sure what position, and I don't know who the third outfielder would be. I feel like I'm drawing a blank.
Davis.
Well, yeah, of course. See, that's another case of a guy who just disappeared off the radar. I mean, he was their opening day left fielder, so of course he'll be in there. You could see Davis in center depending on what they do with Martin and Gonzalez, but boy, that's as many bats as they lose from this team, that's still potentially a pretty good lineup, Chip.
Yeah, Cooper Davis, we're talking about a guy who hit .331, played in 35 games, started 31. So, and he did not hit, I guess, for a month. And you look at his total. So it's nice to know that he's coming back, hopefully healthy. We'll just have to see what his situation. I think he's got a hip situation. So whether he's going to play this summer or not, but coming back totally healthy, it's good to have a guy out there as well in Cooper Davis.
I think this will be one of the more interesting fall ball. What's the word I'm looking? Well, the fall series, whoever they play, I think will be interesting. But just fall. I guess fall camp's not the word, but just fall practice will be interesting just because you got a lot of talented bodies and there's just so many questions about who settles where and just in a couple of instances in terms of who cracks a starting nine, just who, period.
Yeah, and you've got, there's always that coming off a successful season. You've got these leadership roles that are now going to be developed. You got some, your J.J. Belays aren't going to be around anymore, and the guys who get drafted and new faces and a turnover of, as I mentioned, almost half the roster that could be possible with new faces and expectations and guys who, you got a Jason Gonzalez and a Cooper Davis who weren't involved in Omaha on the field. Of course, they were vital in the dugout and supportive roles. But, that's always a work in progress and who takes those leadership roles. I see Harry Ray being a guy who is kind of the glue on the infield. He's already got some leadership characteristics I've noticed, and I'm sure it's good to have a guy like that coming back. So we'll see. And again, it all depends on Clark. If Clark comes back, he's another guy. I think leadership role. He'll take that and hopefully expand that if he comes back.
Off the top of my head, this is the top 5 team in terms of talent. I'm trying to think of the who's will be where. I think that Mississippi State will be preseason top 10 with all that lineup it brings back. State's lineup next year was pretty close to Vanderbilt's. It's going to be one of those lineups for the ages next year. I think even with losing Mangum, Louisville will be really good. They get their third baseman and they get Reed Detmers back. That's a team that brings back a lot of guys. That's one of those teams that'll be in the top 5 mix. LSU, I think, it got its pitching healthier at the end of the year. I think they get a lot of their bats back, but I have to look. I think Florida will be back in the picture. Georgia gets Emerson Hancock back. I think a few more of those arms. The lineup is where I have more of the question. They were great defensively, hitting-wise, not as much. And I can't remember. I think they lose a lot of their infield guys. So I think they'll have the arms. It'll be the lineup parts. Man, goodness, I feel like I'm missing some teams. But off the top of my head, that's
you have UT. You have UT. With the resurgence. I mean, you can't forget those teams that have kind of pushed forward. So it's just a league of excess as far as the SEC and you're going to have teams around the country who are going to reload, and it's hard to project now who's going to be good. It's just going to be the SEC keeps getting better as far as what we're going to be facing week in and week out.
Yeah, Arkansas with Kierstad and Martin will have a really good offense. Their pitching will have to step up. They lose Isaiah Campbell, and they lose their closer, Cronin, too. So they've got some holes to fill there, but Dave Van Horn just always seems to find kids. Tennessee, I saw Garrett Crochet made the Team USA today, and I think Solari, their left fielder, who's one of the better hitters in the league, is back. So, yeah, that's a team that'll take some steps too. But we'll have to see how things settle after the draft because that has a big thing. And, by the way, I think Florida is losing or lost Matthew Allen to the draft. He was I don't know if a Kumar Rocker type arm is overstating it, but a really good one that they were counting on getting to campus that now is either signed or I think – close to signing, which also affects Vanderbilt with Blake McIntosh, by the way.
Sure, exactly.
Okay, one or two more, and I'll get you out of here. Raiders 1967 wants to know, speculate on role and performance of the following pitchers next season: Ethan Smith, Eric Kaiser, Jake Eder.
Well, I'll start with Eder. I think Eder has a chance with what he did towards the end of the year of taking that Sunday role. I think he showed a lot of poise, although he was trying to throw the ball. I think towards that last couple outs, throwing the ball 115 miles an hour. It's just, I can understand the butterflies there. He was overthrown a bit, but I think he has the poise to give you that lefty arm of a weekend rotation to fill that role. As far as the other guys, I mean, there's a lot of talent that you mentioned with Kaiser. I mean, there's just a lot of arms there that hopefully during this time when they hadn't gotten much action here in summer ball, to be able to push forward, and take their role when they go into a fall with a fresh perspective where they're going to be called on more. But, you look at their numbers. I mean, Fisher, 4.41 ERA, Ethan Smith, 3.27 ERA. Ethan Smith was 4-0, Fisher 2-0, Eder 2-0, and they had ERA of 2.97. So those guys, they're going to have a chance to contribute right off the bat and battle for roles, and that's what it's all about, and getting better this summer. And hopefully, if they're nicked up, they'll be able to get take care of their arms and do that, because they have a chance. There's some holes there to step up their role and finish things off and get started for that 2020 campaign.
Last question, Vandy Doors 04 says, how much more does Corbin have to do, if at all, to be considered the greatest in college baseball, not just in recent years? He says points of reference: Skip Bertman, Augie Garrido, Rod Dedeaux, and Pat Casey at Oregon State.
Well, that's tough. Skip Bertman, with all the appearances that he had in NCAA tournaments and going to Omaha, will always be considered up there along with Garrido, Augie, but I think Tim's up there. I'm not discounting it. What he's done, what he's taken with a program that was a big deal to make the SEC tournament, much less the NCAA tournament, back when they only took a certain number of teams. So I think just what he's done for college baseball in general, what he stands for, what he fights for, trying to get the paid third assistant instead of the volunteer role, the volunteer tag removed, and which I really enjoyed his press conference and believe everything he said as far as, I'm really worried about losing David Macias. And I think that's, I'm not speaking out of turn here. I don't know anything, but I think Tim basically, through his comments, how can he keep a David Macias, a very talented kid who, he's not a kid, a talented coach who could get jobs elsewhere, and I know loves working with Tim and those guys, but he's got to get his funding from somewhere else. And I know you talk about just a quick turnaround. They get the Vanderbilt baseball camp, which starts, I think, July 1st next week, and so they go through this, and that's got to start up. And that's one of the big income producers for those volunteer coaches of the camps. And so what he's done for that and baseball in general, and being on the rules committee and all those things, he's at the top. And I don't think you have to worry about any time him falling from that. It'll be because he wants to. Now, I know Tim, the guy that I don't think he's going to coach forever. I don't think he's going to be a guy who coaches into his 60s. And I think he'll end up just stepping away from the game one time, but hope it's not anytime soon. But what he's done for the game, not just on the field, but the way he runs his program, he's up there, I think, with when his time looks back on it, is one of the best that's ever coached a college game.
Tying into this question, I think the next 2 or 3 years will be very interesting for him because they're set up the next 2 years to have runs at national titles just with the arms that they have. That alone, if you're hitting it's just okay, you're going to be in that mix. So that begs a question. Let's say they were to win a couple back-to-back or maybe win one and finish runner-up or get to Omaha in another. At that point, I think he has to be considered. I mean, he's already one of the greatest ever. Then I think those other guys won more titles. So I think until he gets another one or two, just to be safe, you maybe have to defer those other guys a little bit, although the situation is quite different. And obviously creating something for himself has to be factored in there too. But just to be conservative, that's kind of the way I see it. But that could be interesting. Let's say that Tim wins back-to-back titles the next 2 years. I'm not making a prediction, but it's a possibility. Is that a point where he just says, hey, I've done all I can do? He has a heart for people and other things. I do wonder if there's a chance that he gets to the top of the mountain and says, there's not much more I can do. I want to serve people and maybe the game in other ways. I think it is something to maybe put on your radar, because I do think that the last few years, you just look at him. I think that with the tragedy with Donnie Everett, and his wife said this to somebody, I don't remember if it was Adam Sparks or Aaron Fitt, but I think there was a point in time where maybe he questioned, is it time to step away? I do think that is on the radar of possibility. Again, I may be speaking out of turn. I don't know what he thinks, but you just look at the dynamics of the last few years and what's ahead. Part of me says I could see Tim coaching to 80 just because he loves it so much that I think it will be hard for him to step down. Part of me says, hey, if he does win a couple more, it's worth asking in his mind maybe what's left.
Chris, I think the advantage for if you're a Vanderbilt fan and you're wanting Tim Corbin to stay around is the fact that he doesn't have young children. He and Maggie have, Maggie has children from her previous marriage, Hannah and Molly, and Tim, of course, treats them, and they consider him their dad. I mean, it's a very close family relationship. But they do not have young children like, for instance, my age. I have an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And I hearken back to when Ray Tanner stepped down, and that was kind of seeing Ray Tanner out there this weekend. He's the one who handed Tim the trophy. Ray Tanner, the former South Carolina coach, who was the head of the Division I baseball committee, and they do that every year, the head of that. And a lot of people thought, well, Ray Tanner just walked away from the game. God, I couldn't believe it, way too early, and why did he do it? And they went to back as far as championship series final appearances, and they built a new stadium. And when I had an opportunity to be in Columbia a couple of years ago and I did some work for ESPN, I was a color commentator, and Ray Tanner came in the box during innings, and I shook hands with him. He was very cordial to me, and we talked about that. And we talked about, I'd seen him a year before pitching batting practice. He pitched batting practice to his team once a weekend when they played, and I talked to him on the field when I was doing some other TV work. And I said, well, how do you like it not being around the game? He said, well, it's different. But he said the moment that changed it for him was when his child at the time, the year he got out, was having first communion at his church, his very first communion. And he had to watch it on a cell phone because he was out of town coaching. And he said that's what did it for me. He was missing opportunities to be with his children. He has young children. At the time, they were in, teenage years or young teenagers. And in that situation, I think with Tim, they don't have Maggie and Tim don't have young children that would lure him away. The first thing that Tim Corbin said to me in the hotel after the game, and this is just, he's a very family guy, and I found this as funny. It was around midnight, and he was getting ready to get on the elevator, and I was waiting for him, and he gave me a hug, and the first thing out of his mouth, he looks at me and goes, "What in the world are you doing here?" He said, "I can't believe you came out here, man. I so appreciate it." I mean, I'm sitting here congratulating him, and he's all your young kids and everything you got going on, because he knows my kids. He's met them before, and that's just the way he thinks. I think if he had young kids or another distraction, being a good distraction, I'm not saying it's a bad one, it would change his mentality. But it was funny that's the first thing out of his mouth was he couldn't believe I was there, because he knew that as you do, we got our hands full, but that's just the way Tim's programmed. So I think he's got a couple more years in him. After that, I don't know. I think the Donnie Everett thing changed him, and forever will, and will always be there. But I don't think any Vanderbilt fans have anything to worry about in the near future. I do not think, and this is just something I heard him speak one time, he's not going to be like his mentor at Clemson, Leggett, and coaching that into that age that Leggett did. I think he will not do that. I think he'll do something else, and he'll find something else to do that he'll be passionate about and be just as good at that he is in coaching.
Chip, that was a fantastic podcast. I so enjoyed having you as a guest this year. I know we will do this next year and maybe find an excuse to do one or two in between as things change with the draft and such. But thank you so much for joining us this year. I had so many great comments on your appearances. Tell folks about your real estate business. This is the time if they have needs that they need to be finding an agent and getting stuff done if they're planning to move this summer. Tell folks about what you do at Fridrich & Clark.
Sure, Chris, and it's been a pleasure to be on with you too. Met some people in Omaha who maybe recognized my voice when I was talking to someone, and they tapped me on the shoulder and said they enjoyed them. So you do a great job on me. So thank you as well. And I'll just make this quick. Our company, Fridrich & Clark, we're Vanderbilt people. We're Vanderbilt graduates. My late father played basketball there. My brother, Steve, went there. And I, of course, played there and went there. So a lot of Vanderbilt connections. If you're looking for real estate services for buying or selling your home in Middle Tennessee, check our website out and then check us out. We've got 170 agents here in Nashville, Middle Tennessee area, one in Brentwood, one office in Brentwood, one in Green Hills. I'd love to talk to you, to your listeners, about any of their real estate needs for the residential market. You can look us up at frederickandclark.com. Give me a call personally, and I'll walk you through the process at 615-327-4800.
He's Chip Fridrich. I'm Chris Lee. We are sorry we are just now getting a second podcast for the week up on Friday afternoon, but we've got more of these to come as I get caught up at home and get in touch with some guests. But anyway, we're not finished putting a bow on the national title. We've got all kinds of content at Vandy Sports, not just there now, but coming. That is all free right now. So if you've been to Vandy Sports, and not even a trial subscription or anything required, just all of our content right now related to baseball is free. So I hope you'll go over there and visit that. That's kind of our gift to you as you revel as fans in a national title. But anyway, thanks to Chip and all my guests this year. Again, we will have more baseball related podcasts to come in the next few days. Thank you for listening to the Vandy Sports Podcast. Back with another episode very soon.